Mercado-Lara. Fun fact, funny story, I got in touch or got acquainted with Eunice's work through Martina Efegini, who's another Civic Science Fellow. And so looking through, just talking with her, looking through the profiles of all the fellows, I came across her work and I was like, yes, this is so fascinating. We'll love to get in touch and see if you come by and give a talk. And here we are. So Eunice, it's wonderful to see you. She thinks a ton about collaboration, among many things. In fact, on her LinkedIn, this is what she's written on LinkedIn. I don't know if you checked your LinkedIn recently, Eunice, but you've written this part, that you're dedicated to helping organizations and institutions to improve collaboration and knowledge sharing dynamics. And that's the first sentence, actually. And that speaks volumes to the work that you're doing and are continuing to do. Eunice has 8 years of experience in the public sector in science and technology, policymaking. More recently, she has served as an advisor for startups on the responsible use and implementation of new technologies and their regulations. There's a ton in there that we can dissect. She's served on board and committee member in several organizations and initiatives advocating for openness. She holds a master's degree in public policy from McGill University and a BA from El Colegio de San Luis. In today's talk, title, Designing Equitable Funding Programs for Science and Innovation, Eunice will be discussing her work in the Civic Science Fellows program. And I know some of you may have questions about that, so this is a great opportunity to ping those questions with the Open Research Funders Group, ORFG. The ORFG is a partnerships of funding organizations committed to the open sharing of research. Eunice did share a document with me and with everybody earlier that we've been perusing, and she'll take us through that report that has come out. And I have a few questions that I've put together here that later that we will get through in the Q&A. So Eunice has some remarks for about 30 minutes or so, and then the floor will be open for questions. For those of you that are watching live stream, feel free to drop your questions in the chat. I will check there. And for those of you watching in the future, just get in touch with Eunice, okay? Her profile link is below in the chat there, so just go there and find her and email her. Eunice, welcome to SAI.
Manuel, thank you. Thanks for organizing this session, and I'm super happy to be here and to share with you, which I think I took some time when you first invited me to take a look at the work you've been doing, and I would describe you very humbly as a community of action. And what I like the most from these community of actions is that you never end learning. So as you've mentioned, this kind of active interactions and are super valuable opportunities to co-create together. Before starting my talk, and thanks for the kind introduction, Manuel, I would like just to briefly kind of present myself in a different way, which is I am a person which has this public policy background, but I've always, when I speak or in every single project I get involved, I always keep in mind the organizational dimension of the project, which means, because ultimately I did some research in my previously in my career as a researcher. The key for collaboration is never a technical, it's off like 99% of the times. It's not about a technological issue. It's not about a lack of resources. It's always the willingness of doing it. So that's like how the organization structures itself and how the incentives within the organizations can be aligned. So most of my thinking of the work that I've been doing in the past is under the belief that we are social animals, social entities, and organizations can help us to improve and to make that characteristic more powerful and effective. I have this brief presentation, which is on the work that I am doing for the Open Research Funders Group, but this is a sample of how can we co-create our research or innovation ecosystem. So I'll share my screen very briefly. Here it goes. And sorry if I'm going to point out in this direction since I have my screen facing this way. So here it goes. So I'll skip this one. So what is the Open and Equitable Model Funding Program? That's the program that I am leading within the Open Research Funders Group. It's basically a research-oriented community of practice. Research funders, because it's basically the funders, the ones who are there. It's a community of practice where research funders can do something similar as the things you are doing in these webinars. Like they basically share their experiences. They discuss what are the challenges in making grant making or their grant making more equitable and open in terms of fostering or enabling open science, open research practices. So the questions we face are something like, how can I incentivize my grantees to disseminate and engage further besides the publications, besides the traditional research outputs? And the second dimension is not only about what do my grantees produce, but also how can I enlarge the pool of grantees? How can I make my grant making more accessible and more equitable for other potential applicants or other researchers which could be interested, but in a less in a disadvantaged position to apply for these grants. So after having these discussions for several years, the Open Research Funders Group decided to create this program where it's basically a lab where funders are piloting and testing all those what ifs. And when I say what ifs, I'm referring to a set of actions that we have developed, and I'll discuss this in a bit more detail later. But to test some actions, to say, okay, let's do something. Those crazy things that perhaps we wouldn't be as comfortable doing in a full program or within the full organization, but let's try those small things in one single program, in one funding round, and let's say what happened, and let's share our learnings in this process. So the program, I would say, has three components. The first one, and I briefly described it, is it's a cohort of funders, 11 research funders. Most of them are within the US. They are tailoring and piloting a set of interventions within their grant making or their funding programs. And they are sharing the lessons learned. And ultimately, and when I say we, I mean the team behind the program, we are going to, we are compiling those learnings, and we are sharing those learnings in the documents we have within our website, which I'm going to include in the chat box if you want to take a look. So, and we are sharing the learnings there too, for everyone to contribute to it. Okay. I'm not really good at. There you go. So, so they are learning about. We are compiling those lessons learned, and we are creating these guidance and documents in our website, so anyone can contribute to that learning. Let's say that you are an organization, a funding organization, you are not part of this cohort. You can take any of the documents we have there and implement the same actions within your grant making, or let's say that you're a grantee and you have a better idea. We briefly discussed with Fanuel before the session start some cool ideas to enable more collaboration among researchers. And maybe you have something to add at that point. Say like, hey, I've tested this and I would like you to consider this and these other resources. You can also do that. Which takes me to the first and most important component of the program, which is the community. All the actions that we have identified or interventions we have identified for this program were drafted upon or from discussions we had with the community. We've been having open discussions with the academic community, especially with researchers coming from underserved backgrounds, to understand what are the areas funders could make a larger effort to improve their participation within the scientific discussion. So again, like our commitment with these learnings is to leave them open for them to keep nourishing and benefiting from them. And the second component, which I think is the less relevant, because we are only the people who put everything together, is a team behind the program. And I'll cover that component at the end, because it's basically me and a bunch of super talented people, but we are the ones who kind of translate that kind of the input we get from the community into the primers or the documents we are giving to the funders. And I'll speak about this work in more detail, because a huge component for collaboration is the sense of belonging. How can I, and this is a challenge we are facing, how can I create specific recommendations for professional funders, but be open enough or welcoming enough so anyone, regardless their background, can contribute to these materials? So that's the main challenge, which takes me to the next slide, which is how do we gather contributions, and how can we make sure that those voices are heard and they become, or those inputs translate and become into action. So we have a working group. We named it the Open and Equitable Working Group, and they are basically our experts within grant making, open research practices, or they've been doing a ton of work to understand underserved communities within academia or minorities within academia. So they were initially the main source of these interventions, and they usually are the person or the entity where which we kind of have these discussions in a more, I'll say, specialized way. Let's say that we get a couple of ideas in a form of, what if you, I don't know, give this amount of money to translate documents from one language to another? So we take that discussion with this working group, and we brainstorm around ways on how a funder can actually make it. What are the constraints they may have? What would be the regulations around those particular ideas or frameworks? And the larger source of and by when I say larger, I mean by number. The larger source of input usually comes from the open community calls. We started hosting open community calls each month. We realized that they were more productive if we kind of gave some time to the community to chew the ideas, to disseminate internally through their networks, to invite more people to join. So now we are hosting them every 2 or 3 months, and anyone is welcome to join these open community calls. And when we have these community calls, we usually disseminate them at least 2 weeks in advance through our Twitter account. And what we've seen in these community calls is that we've gotten representation from other funding organizations, other research institutions, government agencies, advocacy groups or organizations, or just researchers which are interested to improve the way science is funded. Just very briefly, this is the funders cohort. Those are the organizations which bravely took the first step to test most of the actions that we are testing among funders. And what I would add here is it's a very diverse pool of funders. It's not only the big and large organization. We also have smaller organizations, highly specialized in specific fields, which often have harder times in innovating. And we also have international funders, not only funders working within the US, we have funders piloting these initiatives at an international level, which, to be honest, makes it more complicated. And we also have funders across the disciplines, not only STEM, we also have the humanities, we also have life sciences. And I think that has helped us a lot to create a very comprehensive set of recommendations, because we have at least tested the interventions for more than one type of organization. And that helps other organizations to see themselves reflected in this cohort and say, hey, maybe I can try. It's not only for those large entities to be part of this innovative part. What is the timeline, or how does this pilot work? Because this program is a pilot. We are going to be here only for 2 years. That's the initial plan. We'll see. We're not going to drop the pen by the end of the second year. But so far, what's more clear for us is the road ahead in the first 2 years. So we launched the cohort. We started working in September last year, and we started by having these conversations with the academic community, and we devoted enough time, and it's never enough, I'll change that word. We devoted at least half of the program's time to understand those needs and having those conversations with the community, and to make sure that we were as open as possible, and that we have done as much as we could to include every person which could be interested in participating in this conversation. We launched the cohort until April this year, and from April to July, we had discussions with funders on what kind of interventions they felt more interested to implement, or in which order they would prefer to do so. And they will have 1 year, starting last July till next July, to test these actions. And why 1 year? Because usually funding rounds, they tend to be, if not annual, they respond to the year. Fiscally, they respond to the year programming. So we wanted to make sure they had at least 1 year to test those interventions and to observe how they behave throughout this year. We are getting together once a month with a cohort, and in these sessions we hear from their lessons learned and the challenges, but we also add more complexity to the interventions they are implementing. Let's say that they are implementing translation services for certain grantees. We wanted to, during the last session, we were discussing how could we make sure that we are considering not only one language, that we are considering also other languages which could be relevant for these particular fields. So in those discussions is where we kind of feel how much can we learn and how much can we innovate, keeping our feet on the ground, because at the end we need to compile some learnings and to deliver something to the a kind of report at the end of the program. The program ends September next year, and we plan to have like 3 months of post-mortem debriefing to identify what's next for this program, what are the best ways to make it more actionable for funders and more inclusive for anyone within the community to contribute. Still, we are designing that component. If you have any ideas, we are more than happy to hear from you. And this is a team behind the program. You'll see beyond the names 3 organizations. The Open Research Funders Group is a hosting organization, but it's also a Health Research Alliance. The Health Research Alliance is a group which puts together a large amount of health-oriented funders, and they had several significant experiences in making their grant making more inclusive. So we are learning from their experience, but they are also they found in this program the lab or the place where they could actually test them. In pre-review, a big chunk of this work is bias, and how can we make sure that during the review process of the applications, reviewers are adequately representing the community they are going to review, and the criteria they are implementing is less biased, because we know that bias is is almost impossible to eliminate. So how can we manage bias? How can we understand unconscious bias? And how can we train reviewers for being more aware in creating reviews that ultimately are constructive for the applicant? I'll just wrap up here to basically open the floor for your ideas, for your questions. And there's my email. If you feel like we welcome contributions in any shape or form. We recognize that maybe participating in public or in a video conference is not the best way for everybody. So feel free to send me an email. Feel free to reach me out in any social. I don't use a lot of social media, but I'm definitely in LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out in any way that makes you feel more comfortable. And I'll stop there, Fanuel, and pass it over to you.
Great. So a few times where seminar speakers follow my instructions, like less is more. So this is good. It opens up the floor for really a lot of interesting questions. And for those of you who do not know, Eunice did share with me a draft guidance for open science funding. And so it's a document with lots of ideas, some of which you've discussed here. And I want to open the floor, just asking the first question with respect to help me understand. So these funders, right? You shared a slide of all of them. I didn't see any federal ones. They were all just foundation.
Private.
They were private funders. Okay. And are you engaging with the program officers in those foundations?
Yeah.
Is that okay? So I was curious who exactly in there are you engaging with. So the one component of the guidance that you sent, I wanted to just open the floor regarding to committing to providing the funding required to operationalize open science, right? And one of them, the bullet points, is systematically including funding for science communication, public engagement, and related activities. Are you able to share some of the thinking around that, and what are the funders saying, where is that thinking going?
Yeah, for sure. The first thing, I would say that most of the funders within this cohort, they recognize that dissemination is important. But I think funders are at this stage to realize that dissemination is also a component, or let's say, it's also a stage of the research project. So traditionally, and you know better than I do, that whenever you got the paper, it was basically the result of your project. You said like, okay, I did this amount of data collection, I did this amount of analysis, I sent all my results to this journal, and now my paper was accepted. And now I have this paper, and that's it. More and more funders are recognizing that dissemination and further engagement is something they would like to have, is something they would like to see, but the consequence of that recognition is we need to fund those activities as well, because it's not only about saying, yeah, you go and tweet something about it, you go and share it in a conference. I mean, all those actions are super valuable, but that's basically those are additional activities that if would be considered within the grant or within the proposal, grantees would have more incentives and resources to do so. So the first thing is recognizing it as a component, a crucial component of the research project or the research life cycle is one of the things funders are doing in making those expenses eligible for within their grants is one of the things they are doing. The discussion goes more complicated, or becomes more complicated, because it's not only about giving money, it's also about providing some kind of guidance, because you start having these discussions on, okay, what is dissemination? Is dissemination just publishing an article in a journal? Is dissemination publishing something on social media? Is it all that above? And the response depends on what results you want. what we've seen is that depending on the mission of the funder, they define dissemination. And we've seen tons of initiatives and actions they are taking. I'll just give 2 examples on the actions they are doing that I found very exciting. There's this fund, I'm not allowed to say names or to name names at this point.
I was about to ask, like, yeah, you don't say any names, you don't have to.
Okay, there's one funder which took this very seriously, and they are providing trainings to their grantees on how to disseminate their work in a form of not only how to understand social media and how to create content within social media based on the research they are doing, but also how to write a blog post, how to write a tweet post, how to use the tools within social media, how to write a policy brief, how to reach out a journalist. So it's the format is relatively simple because it's just 2 hours every 2 weeks. But as a grantee, I think it's highly valuable because at the end, it's not only the skills you're gaining, but also you get a certificate. Like it's also like the training itself, it's valuable for the grantee. So it's not only giving you the money to do so and to allow you to create that expense or that kind of section within your budget, but also kind of guide you on how to do it. We've gotten other reactions for funders because we know not every funder can do this. That usually is expensive. But what options on that same vein could be, and we are testing them, compiling information that's relevant for grantees. You don't have to have this training specialized, guided by one professor. You can compile information and share that information and those tips and among your grantees, besides providing resources. And the last thing that we've seen that is happening there is the understanding that sharing, it's not only about sharing in social media, but also there are other research outputs which are super valuable, such as data, such as code, such as protocols. So how can we ensure that all those materials are also available and are also at the disposal and also free to use and reuse for any other? So how can we also make sure that those other components are going to be there, and we as funders align with the incentives around or towards that objective? And for that end, we are also helping them to develop open policies or policies for open access for the materials they are funding. Some of them are also investing in infrastructure, repositories, but yeah, it's the open science route.
Yeah, and it just got me thinking that the NSF, for example, is really one of the leaders, right? The broader impacts, right? And I think they're looking at this, if we stay with the science communication public engagement thread, they are, they get really diverse ideas, right? From people, not only just tweeting, but maybe some programming elements around it. I want to work with high school students to help collect this data X, right? Kind of like citizen science thing going on, right?
Exactly.
So is this what you're seeing kind of thing with these private funders who want to do more of this?
For sure. Like they want to get more engagement. We had like these conversations in this seminar that I was making reference a few moments ago. A grantee was asking, do you think my presence in social media would incentivize my funder to give me more money? And my response was like, I don't know if your presence in social media will, but engagement definitely will create some or some kind of impact, would definitely incentivize your funder to provide more funding. And the last thing, just to close this idea, I think at this dimension, the challenging part is recognition. How can we make sure that the work that you as a researcher do in civic engagement and dissemination eventually accounts for maybe another grant, maybe tenure and promotion? How is that actually going to help you to advance your career beyond just accomplishing what a funder asked you to do under a grant?
Yeah, beyond checking a box.
Exactly.
Because we want to get away from that. I want to check this box so that I'm
Exactly.
good and get the money, but actually doing the work, because this is part of, we want science to be accessible. We want science to be disseminated, right? More broadly, to have more people be part of it. And I love what you said earlier, that translation services is something that, as we think about dissemination, right? How do we get these papers unlocked, right? From English to other languages. As I mentioned earlier, I was talking to Dr. Rania Verk earlier today, and she actually published a paper in the JSPG looking at this exact thing, right? And I think it falls into this line there: science communication, accessibility. So I think it's really great to hear that this is an active discussion among funders as they try to figure out how can we have impact in this space, right? And I wanted to add on, like, are funders thinking also, how can researchers, because we're talking about researchers, right, who are writing scientific grants, right?
Yeah.
Collaboration, for example, with folk that maybe have expertise, have programs already that can supercharge whatever they're doing, right? And I think this is part of that grant writing process, that can funders be innovative and say, okay, as part of this grant, yes, you can, we want to have ideas of how you can disseminate this, but we encourage also collaborations in that angle, right? That, and I'm curious if you've thought about collaboration, and what are they saying?
That kind of, with that kind of collaboration among grantees,
Yeah,
we've seen happening at least in two moments within the grant making life cycle. The first one, or the project life cycle. The first one is during congresses. Some funders, they organize congresses around certain topics, especially if they fund only in specific areas, and they invite their grantees. So that collaboration, that's how we've seen collaboration happens. And the other thing is when funders engage with grantees beyond the grant life cycle, when they nourish an alumni and network community, and when they invite those past grantees, now alumni, to be part of the board, to be part of a review committee, to be part of other components of the decision-making process for further funding rounds. So that's how we've seen it happening within this cohort. I know other things which are also interesting. We have not tested them. Which, I don't know if you've heard about the sand pits.
No.
Sand pits is like this design of grant making program. Like, funders organize sand pits before identifying what projects they are going to fund. And based on, and a sand pit would be basically, this is a sand pit around climate change. And subscribe yourself in any sand pit that you would like to be in, and identify whom within that room you could collaborate. And you organize yourself, put together a project, and come and reach me. And then I'll decide what of the projects I would fund. That's very, very cool and interesting way to incentivize collaboration prior to the funding. We have not tested it yet because those sand pits, you can imagine, take more than a year to organize and to fund and to identify and to invite. Most of the times, funders, they know very well the space under which they work, but ideally these collaborations should be interdisciplinary. So that outreach definitely takes collaboration among funders to say, like, okay, we need to get together around certain topics, and I'll let you know who's been working with me on that particular area. So that kind of additional work before the development or the design of the program is the one that we decided that it would take more than a year, and we fell short.
Out of the scope. And I think it's cool that you said collaboration among funders. That is
Yeah.
actually fascinating to hear, right? Usually you think of funders, they're by themselves, they want to get their own little, communities going and funding lines. But it's great to hear that there are these sandpits, as you said. I'm gonna have to look this up and and study more. I'm asking all the questions here intentionally, of course, but I do want to open the floor for anybody else who wants to jump in and ask Eunice any questions. And don't be shy. Okay, we'll keep going, Eunice. And if there are any questions come up, please drop them in the chat or just jump in, and I'll keep quiet. One of the things as well, I wanted to ask about impact. And I think if we keep the thread on the science communication angle, dissemination part, how are funders thinking about impact, especially with relevance to open science? Right? What is the meaning of impact in that space?
That's a super short answer. No, there's no short answer. Every funder has its own definition of impact. And that's basically the question that we have been keeping in mind. How can we make sure that we have this, how can we as funders have this sense of whatever we are doing, we are going in the right direction? Like, how can we know that? It's super hard. Like, there's like the technical response, which is create indexes, create a logic framework, and identify and track. We, I'll say, are one step before impact, which is tracking outputs. We have, like, funders have done a lot in tracking the outputs they have funded, and by asking for DOIs and all the identifiers to grantees, and identifying where they feel more comfortable publishing, what kind of outputs they do, how can they engage. But it's super hard to measure impact beyond the metrics which we don't necessarily want to rely on, which are the bibliometrics. But it's super hard. Some funders are using altmetrics, which I would say is the most innovative within the metrics dimension. But others, which I think it's more innovative, they are also accepting these statements, which is a more descriptive way, or narrative statements, where they say, like, I had this impact in my project because I don't know, and they basically share the stories of the communities they've been working with, and they share the connections they were able to make, or they were able to facilitate. Maybe they were not the ones connecting with more people, they just facilitated people to get to know themselves. So that is, I think, the most innovative way in which I've seen funders recognizing and identifying impact, not only by tracking the outputs and the metrics associated to the outputs, but also some of them are taking into consideration narrative statements in terms of the impact the grantee identifies.
Yeah, and I think I love that you separated out those outputs from the outcomes, right? And I think that usually in our fellows program, we drill this in, that you gotta think through this. Well, what are your outputs? Tanya, I think maybe you're smiling. I hope you remember the stuff we talked about with respect to outputs and outcomes, right? And you're right, it's really hard, like that definition. And each funder has their own meaning. In fact, even each fundee, right, that they give, what are you trying to do, and what is the meaning of impact for you, and does that fit within the framework of what we fund? I can imagine this being part of that calculus.
And I love that you highlighted it, because that's exactly the logic behind these narrative statements, because the logic of a funder is, I am not the expert, I am funding the expert. So I think it's a very wise and humble position to say, you tell me, what do you think is the right output for your project? What's the right impact I should be tracking? Because maybe I want to see a paper, but maybe it's not a paper, maybe it's a database in terms of outputs. In terms of outputs, maybe it's not only the database, but how many people actually went to that database and changed something. But it's super hard for me as a funder to understand. So that's the vacuum in which narrative statements could contribute.
Yeah, and we have a comment here from Claire Holsevsky, and she says, one thing I keep thinking about, especially when it comes to grants, is who holds the power. In the past, we've seen that funders tend to hold the power in the sense of controlling who does what research and what research even gets done. Even though it's the researchers on the ground coming up with the ideas, doing the work, has there been any discussions around the topic and how funders can pass the power to people?
Tons. There are two things. Claire, thanks for your for your idea. I see at least two things. The first one is how the research agenda is drafted, or who sets the research agenda. And the second one is this dynamic funder grantee. So for the second one, yes, we've discussed. This was very interesting. We have discussed a lot that we have to recognize at the beginning that there are a relationship of power. If you're a funder, it's the minute you sit on the table, the conversation is going to change among researchers. So there is a relationship of power if you are a funder. And we have developed a lot of guidance and materials. And I'm not saying that everything is written. And what I'm trying to say is we have discussed and produced some recommendations about how to create relationships as a funder, recognizing that power imbalance. And second, not only focusing on what do I need as a funder, but also how to create long-term relationships, mutually beneficial, not only for grantees or applicants, but also with other organizations. And I think we have advanced in that discussion in a way that funders, they want to collaborate. Funders, they want to contribute to those fields in which they are funding. This is why they are giving their money away. They don't want to be intentionally seen as this guy at the top of the tower, but we have to recognize that's what's happened. So we have basically shared experiences on how to be more approachable. They are, most of them, so all of them are very approachable. But it's often the perception that no, you cannot email the program officer because they are super approachable, and just having that realization and understanding and being open and saying or including the right language within the RFIs, saying send an email, contact us, reach out. It's among the things that we've been discussing. And the second thing on who sets what's get funding and what's not, I think there are two components there. The first one is who's doing the reviews, who's doing the reviews of the applications. And on that, we've done, this program addresses at least two topics. The first one is, among the recommendations we are implementing, is make sure that we have a diverse pool of grantees, that the grantees reviewing those applications are not only full professors, emeritus, or all male. I don't have anything against guys. I like you guys, but which are representative to the people who's going to apply. If you have postdocs, if you have early careers, you want to have them too on the table. You want to have some representation of them. And you want to have also, and this is even more important in fields like, I have this friend, she is biophysicist, but she works in neuroscientist. So for her, it's super hard to get funding because people within physics, they say it's too much bio, and people within bio says it's too much physics. So having also interdisciplinary representation, if you are funding in those fields, recognizing that those problems could be solved from different angles, and the right person, or at least there should be some representation in that panel to raise that topic. And I think, and the other thing, and the last thing that I think we are not covering as much as I would like to, is who sets the research agenda. The research agenda is set by the mission of the organization, and that's a lot. That's pretty much how it's defined. But that conversation becomes even more relevant when it's the research agenda for public funders, not private funders, because they ultimately are using taxpayers' money. I would like to have a more comprehensive response to that. I don't, but I think that question is particularly urgent to start raising and to start thinking through for public funders.
Yeah, and I think the diversity is important to have the reviewers, and for those of us, for example, who are not necessarily writing research grants, direct research grants, maybe we're writing more on the public engagement grants, because a lot of the foundations you showed earlier have those tracks as well, in parallel almost, right? But the processes are almost the same, right? The same questions you brought up are identical, right? Who is at the table reviewing these grants? You want a diverse set of people so that they can understand, why are you trying to build these mini museums across the city to communicate, physics or whatever it is that you're communicating, right? So I think that's just powerful, the way we're thinking about it. And transparency, I think this is what you alluded to, right? Transparency in the process. And I think it is somewhat of a black box.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, as someone who's writing these grants, it is somewhat of a black. Some places are great. You get to see you get to get a sense, and they give you feedback. And I think this is something maybe you've talked about, and it's tough, I think, with the volume of applications. Feedback can be hard, but for fundees, feedback is golden, right?
Yeah.
I'll take it wherever I can get it.
And you touched 2 points, which I think are super important. The first one is transparency. Like oftentimes funders, they have a very, I would make the precision, private funders. They have a tough decision to make, whether investing more money to give money or just giving more money. Most of them, they want just to give more money. Say like, hey, I want to advance in this topic, and I would like to make sure that I'm giving the largest amounts that I can, rather than investing more money in giving money. This eventually, you can imagine, brings the problem of bandwidth. So among the discussions we're having is how to make it more, how to be transparent in an efficient way. And among the ideas we are kind of chewing and putting together is creating a rubric, an evaluation rubric that's publicly available when you disseminate your RFI. And that same rubric, you can share it to your reviewers. And the way they should respond is, or something like, it complies, it does not comply, and why. If they do the yes, no, and why, that why component gives you immediately the feedback for the applicant, which eventually will help the applicant to improve that proposal. And if patient enough, he or she would be able to reapply for that same funding program
and be successful in the next round.
Exactly.
Questions? Anybody else want to jump in here and ask away, please? Okay, whenever they come, please drop them in there. I wanted to ask the next part of this, thinking about, so the T32, to your last point, training grant, you may be familiar with this. So the NIH, this is the NIH training grant. They actually have their not rubric, but they have their guidance about what they review, right, on their T30, which I think is great, right? But not everybody does this, right? And so I'm glad to hear that there is discussion about whatever the rubric is, right? Just share it so people know what it is. And when they're writing their proposals, it can line up. So our community here, we are early stage founders, right? A lot of us who are building these science communication, public engagement initiatives, and funding in this space. I think I'm glad to hear that. I'm sensing that you think these foundations are increasing funding in this endeavor. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah.
Okay, that's music to everybody. Hopefully people are like cheering on because I think it is important, right, to continue to fund this space. I think I'm looking at even here with Adriana Bankston's journal as well, like getting more funding to continue to do that work of disseminating policy, ideas out in the world, right? Like something like translation services, which they have published as well. So what is your advice for us? Like, because we're not writing these core research grants, right? And so I'm just curious if there are any insight that you can share from your meetings to us who are running these initiatives that require funding. And I would like for you to also use your hat from your startup days. It says you've engaged startups in the past. What insights can you share there that can help us as we go forth?
For sure. I would say three things. The first one, it's important to know your work. It's important you to understand what is your project, what could be other ways in which you could frame your project, and what are your, I don't want to be like super into venture capital-ish person, but what's your value? What's your business value within your project? And the reason why is because funding programs won't necessarily have that name in the program. So oftentimes you'll find that funding through, let's say, a funder who funds within your field for that particular thing you're doing, or they don't have that particular segment, but they have a larger program to fund any kind of initiative. So if you understand what are those tags under which you could start looking for funding, let's say neuroscience plus public engagement plus, I don't know, open databases plus co-creation, I would identify all of those potential tags and look for who's funding this. Funders tend to fund based on different logics and different reasons and different, not always is a field. So understanding what are your underlying tags, it's the key. So you can start looking for different funders. Once you have your tags, the second thing I would say is it's super hard to advise someone on how to apply to all funders, because if you know one funder, you just know one funder. But understanding that funders have one logic. If you can identify anyone with your similar characteristics and you can have a chat with this person, knowing, hey, who funded you? Why? For how much? How much did you ask? It'll help you. Those are super real questions. Like that is going to help you to understand what kind of asks is more suitable for each funder and the funders within your field. This is rare, but happens. Funders usually don't give people's grant. Applicants oftentimes ask for smaller amounts because they feel it's going to be more likely to be funded. And oftentimes funders don't give that grant, don't grant that grant because they would prefer to give a larger amount, which it's rare, but happens. So what is the adequate amount? And the second and the third thing, once you have identified and you are super comfortable with all the tags to your project and who are the funders funding within that space, take the time to do your work before contacting the program officer. Say, hey, I have this awesome project. Take the time to do your work, understand what they have funded in the past. If they have a database on projects, universities or institutions, geographic regions where they funded, lifespan of the project, try to make a proposal. And the last thing, it's always better to get funding takes time because it requires, like, the most successful fundraisers that I've met, they take about 3 years to get $1 million for a startup. which is different. It's completely different in that sector than in the academia, or more like research oriented towards for academic purposes. But creating a relationship with a funder takes time, but it's better to start as soon as possible. And a good way to start creating a relationship with a funder is identifying those sections in which your work and their interests overlap, sharing your products, sharing your platforms, sharing the work you've been doing with a program officer is the first thing I would do before asking for money. And maybe engaging with the events that funder is kind of funding or promoting, or and the discussions they are leveraging.
Yeah, and I think the aligning yourself, for example, with open science, right? If you have an initiative of some kind you're designing, targeting those funders that have interest in that space and saying, this is what we're doing, as you said, developing the relationships. So as we come to a close here, and this has been a fantastic conversation, I wish we just keep on going, all day long. With respect to open science and thinking about engagement, are there any ideas? So imagine there's some future person who is thinking about starting something to target open science, to make science more accessible, right? Outside translation services, because I think that field will continue to burgeon in time. I truly believe this. Any other ideas, or you don't want to be prescriptive, but a sense of like places where there are massive gaps and no one is targeting? TikTok. And funders are like, hey, actually, we would love to have more people.
I don't know if funders are, I know funders are not targeting this under this name, but an area that I see there's full of room of innovation and to get a lot of public engagement interaction is TikTok. I know it sounds weird, but if researchers, and I've seen a lot of them, would or research projects would engage with TikTok in a fun and engaging way, and they can prove, and they can, because you can funnel the audiences through social media. It's not social media by itself. If you could funnel people through your article, to your database, using social media adequately, to me, and I said TikTok because that's what people is doing now, but you can also use any other social media. The adequate use of social media to increase your outreach, that's something that I would encourage everyone to do. Not social media, but social media itself, but to funnel to other research outputs.
Yeah, and with that, Eunice, this has been wonderful. I want to thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights that will live on our YouTube channel as well for people to watch later and really, I think, digest. I think there's so much in there to take apart. I need to take time to process myself, thinking through what initiatives for our fellows in the future, right? Because we get diverse ideas. I think they're going to watch this and think about, okay, let me look into open science and think about where is this field going? And as you said, there is more funding that's hopefully coming through. Even despite this, the talk of recession that is there. And that's a whole different discussion point. We can get into how funders are addressing the upcoming potential recession, but we won't get into that today. Eunice, thank you so much. And we look forward to engaging with you in other ways.
Thanks, Manuel. It was a pleasure.
All right, thanks everybody. And hopefully you can join us next time. We will be having our fellows pitch day on